Hey, how's everybody feeling? Right. Well, you all have heard the news. The world is coming to an end. Carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere. Half of it is being trapped on the earth, the oceans. The other half is accumulating. Sea levels are rising. Forest fires are increasing. Floods are sweeping across Europe. Hurricanes are increasing. Worsening landslides. More inland floods. The Great Barrier Reef is dying. Plastic straws are being stuck up noses of the turtles. Everybody's dying. But the good news is we don't need fossil fuels or nuclear. We can rely solely on wind and solar panels, and we can just stop eating meat. There's a bit more to the story than that, isn't there? These are things that you're never going to read in the New York Times or the Washington Post. Carbon emissions actually slightly declined over the last decade. In Britain, they've been declining for almost 50 years. Same thing in France. In the United States, carbon emissions have declined 22% between 2005 and 2020. 60% of those reductions are thanks to fracking for natural gas. We reduced our carbon emissions more than any other country in the world, and we did so without cap and trade, without any climate policy. In fact, Obama's proposed cap and trade agenda would have reduced carbon emissions 17%. We reduced them 22%, thanks to old-fashioned American ingenuity. What about natural disasters? Hardly anybody dies of them. Each year, a couple hundred Americans, 200 to 400 people every year, a decline of over 95% worldwide, even as the population quadrupled. No increase in hurricane frequency globally. Landfalling hurricanes are flat. No increase in the cost of hurricanes once you account for more wealth in harm's way. So yes, when a hurricane hits Miami Beach, it causes more damage than it did 100 years ago, but that's because there's more wealth on Miami Beach. In fact, the cost of natural disasters, because our infrastructure is so well developed, so resilient, has actually been going down for the last 30 years. As for those landslides, this famous study from Columbia showed that they're occurring in places where there's high levels of corruption and they're not enforcing good building codes. I live on one of the steepest hillsides in Berkeley, California, and because we have good flood management, the water moves around our house. So the malign vector of disinformation is Greta Thunberg. Whenever she tweets pictures of flooding in India or in Africa, she's deliberately misleading her followers into thinking that it's a result of climate change when we know it's a result of poverty. As for hurricanes, the two main scientific bodies that make predictions say that we may see a 5% increase in hurricane frequency, but we will likely see a 25% decline in frequency and a very modest increase of intensity. What about these two pieces of malign disinformation? What did they do? They did the same thing that you learn in your college statistics class, which is not to make an error in reporting. You might get an increase of reports, but that doesn't mean that there's been an increase in the thing itself. This is the same manipulative technique that people use to suggest an increase in police brutality, in anti-Semitism and racism. You're measuring an increase of reporting because we get better at reporting over time. On the right, you can see what Financial Times did is they simply didn't correct for the reporting error, and on the left, they simply cherry-picked the period after 1980. If you do a full century, there's no increase in hurricanes. No trend of U.S. heat wave frequency or magnitude. This is taken directly from the U.S. government's Fourth National Climate Assessment. The 30s were really hot, it turned out. Like because I became obsessed with this issue, I read every New York Times story about heat waves for the last 150 years. And in the 1930s, like, people are dying in the street, dying in these apartment buildings, they're being, taken to the hospital. And the media coverage, in the middle of the Great Depression, the media coverage of the New York Times was like, I don't know why so many people are dying. I mean, things have been pretty good around here. It was the most blasé attitude in the news media towards all of these heat wave deaths. Meanwhile, when you have a tiny number of heat wave deaths a couple of years ago, it's the world is coming to an end. And so, yes, something in the environment has changed, but it's the mental environment of the people who write for the New York Times, not what's happening in the world. We see declining deaths from heat waves, just a simple technological fix. Can anybody guess why fewer people die in heat waves? Just shout it out. You all are well educated. No increase in droughts in Europe, declining deaths from flooding in Europe. One of the best things about social media is that when I started writing about this issue a few years ago, people would tweet the photos from their little villages in Europe where they would have these lines on the buildings, on the sides of the buildings. You guys ever seen these? And it'd be like, 1560, the flood reached here. 1780, reached here. So we know that that's not true. There is a greater area flooded in many cities around the world. But you see the deaths from flooding is going down everywhere. China, Pakistan, which is one of the places that Greta Thunberg has deliberately misled people. The result of declining deaths from extreme weather events and declining costs of extreme weather events means that the number of extreme weather events that are considered to be a disaster by the only center in the world that properly studies disasters, the only database for natural disasters, the MDAT data center in Belgium, shows a declining number of disasters. So disasters are actually going down because we're becoming so resilient. What explains why more area in cities is flooding is simply because the cities are expanding. And as they are near rivers, more area might be flooded, but you're also managing that flooding better. What about sea level rise? It is happening, but I'm not that worried about it, in part because I've been to the Netherlands. And a third of the Netherlands is below sea level. Some parts of it's 7 meters below sea level. We know how to manage water. The idea that some more precipitation because of climate change is the apocalypse is the most ridiculous conspiracy theory of the many conspiracy theories we've been told. Fires have declined globally by 25%. That's an area about the size of Texas. My biggest concern about the disinformation about fire is that people they're training children to think that fire is bad. Most forests need fire. This is basic forest ecology. When the Europeans came to California, they were shocked that the forests were so smoky, that California was so smoky because there was all of these what we call low-intensity fires burning the woody debris. President Trump wasn't wrong when he said that you just need to rake the forests. They use slightly better, more sophisticated machines than rakes to do that, but forest management determines whether you have high-intensity fires or low-intensity fires. And this was dramatically proven in 2020 when a high-intensity fire in a badly managed public forest arrived at a well-managed private forest, and the high-intensity fire dropped to the ground and became a low-intensity fire. So we're not doomed to lose our montane or mountain forests because of climate change. We just need to manage our forests better. What about the Great Barrier Reef? Turns out that it has record high levels of coral. Ostensibly the highest in 36 years, but we don't know because we've only been measuring it for 36 years. So the death of the Great Barrier Reef was vastly overstated. Peter Ridd, one of the few honest Australian ecologists, was censored by Facebook for accurately reporting record high coral growth in 2021. By 2022, after 2 years of record high coral growth, Facebook finally ended its censorship, at least their publicly acknowledged censorship of Peter Ridd. Recycling plastic is the reason for the plastic waste crisis. 90% of the plastic that you put into your recycling bin does not get recycled. It goes to poor countries where they don't have proper waste management systems. It ends up in the rivers. It ends up in the oceans. Please don't recycle your plastic because it's not being recycled. Just throw it in the trash so it can go to the incinerator or the landfill. As for vegetarianism, I speak from personal experience. It's a difficult eating disorder to maintain. I'm just joking. One of my best friends is a vegetarian. He's not here, though. Most people abandon it after a year, and it's not necessary to saving the natural environment. So how did I come to these conclusions? I spent a lot of time in poor countries. I've seen what it's like when you have to haul your own wood and water. It's a form of oppression for children when you have to spend your day gathering wood and gathering water. There's some beauty to it, but it's a very difficult life. And around the world, there's still 2.5 billion people that rely on solid fuels for their heat and for their cooking. Nobody needs to use solid fuels anymore. We're actually able to completely end our reliance on solid fuels, whether it's wood or dung or coal. We can use things like oil and gas and nuclear as our primary sources of energy. This is my book. How do we want to think about energy and progress? The first thing is we produce abundant amounts of food. There's no risk of running out of food, at least for any physical reasons. We are growing more food on less land. That's the key to creating more habitat for endangered species. The less productive farmlands become grasslands and forests and habitat. What about climate change? Massively outweighed by fertilizer, tractors, and roads, and irrigation. And you can see here it's a little complicated chart, but basically this proves if you have more technological advancements, again, mostly fertilizer, irrigation, and tractors, the little black dots show you'll massively increase production. In the rain-fed systems, if you don't do anything, you'll have a slight decline in productivity. Therefore, helping South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa get access to fertilizer, tractors, and irrigation is the most important thing you can do for the natural environment, for people, and also for climate change. What about the Dutch farmers? They're being dispossessed of their land in many cases, even though they have successfully reduced nitrogen pollution, mostly by just capturing the manure before it turns into liquid so that you can reduce the nitrogen runoff. What about renewables? In my home state of California, where we've invested huge amounts of money in solar panels, we actually saw a decline in the amount of electricity we get from clean energy sources between 2011 and 2021. Why? Because we shut down a nuclear power plant and there was a drought, which meant we had less electricity from hydroelectric. Solar panels, wind turbines are no substitute for either nuclear or hydro. Same thing in New York. After Governor Cuomo shut down the Indian Point nuclear plant, it was instantly replaced 1-to-1 with natural gas. The idea that you can replace nuclear with renewables is a myth. Germany saw a decline in the gross share of renewables, and now the situation has gotten even worse. They've shut down their nuclear plants and are moving back to coal. You see, the problem with renewables on the left is that while the cost of solar panels and wind turbines have come down, the cost they impose on the electrical grid has gone up. And you can see here the price of electricity rises as renewables become a larger part of your electricity grid. This is mostly because you need to spend more money on transmission and more money to back up those power sources when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. All of this was brilliantly predicted 10 years ago. When you get to 30% of your electricity from wind, the value of that wind declines 40%. When solar becomes 15%, the value declines 50%. So solar panels can become cheaper and cheaper, but they can make electricity more and more expensive. This is why California saw our electricity prices rise 7 times more than in the rest of the United States. What about batteries? About $1 trillion for 4 to 6 hours of backing up the electrical grid in the United States. Not going to happen. The underlying problem is that the amount of energy you get from renewables to the amount of energy you put in is too low. Our societies, to be a high-energy industrial society, needs about 8-to-1 return on energy from energy invested. Renewables get you significantly less than that. Why then did solar panels become cheaper over the last decade? People say it's because we became more technologically efficient. It's not really true. Solar panels, in terms of the efficiency of converting sunlight into electricity, only became about 3% more efficient over the last decade. The real reason is that they're just not paying for the labor involved in producing their solar panels. I don't care what you think about renewables, solar panels, nuclear. We should not be purchasing products made by people who our own State Department says the Chinese government is committing genocide against. This is a fundamental moral issue. I can't even talk about it too long. I get too angry and upset. Everyone says, what do you do about the nuclear waste? Well, it's pretty easy. You just store it at the site of production. It's fine. Solid metal fuel rods, they're fine. They don't even need to be moved. What are you going to do with your solar panels? I'm from Berkeley, so we think we can compost them. It's been attempted. It didn't turn out well. There's about 300 times more solar panel waste than nuclear waste. There's no plan to deal with it. Harvard Business Review authors found that when you account for the cost of the management of solar panel waste, solar electricity is 4 times more expensive than the current cost. So we are externalizing, to borrow the preferred language of economists, we're externalizing the environmental cost and the economic cost of solar panels onto taxpayers. Can't you recycle them? Only at very great cost. As soon as you take the solar panels off your roof, they're classified as hazardous. Even before your contractor throws them into a cardboard box on your driveway and they split open and create toxic dust all over the place, they're already hazardous waste, and they have to be properly disposed of. We have to change how we think about energy. Energy is not the enemy of nature. It's enabling us to save more nature. We need high amounts of energy to live a high-energy life. Rich countries can reduce the amount of energy we use per capita by a little bit, but you can't go from German levels to Vietnamese levels. This is very well established. So the key is to reduce the material throughput. Think of your iPhone. Remember your old stereo console systems? Like an environmental nightmare. Remember them? Like you had like 4 of them stacked on top of each other, made of like heavy metals. You'd put them on your curb with a sign that said free on it. Your neighbors would look at it being like, nobody wants that. It would rain on it a few times. It's a ritual. It's sort of a purifying process, and then you put it in the trash. Whole forests were destroyed for my newspaper consumption. So this is how to think about it. Energy is a substitute. Your iPhone requires huge amounts of energy to power the servers, but there's less material throughput. So this is the right picture. Dematerialization. That's the main event. It's decarbonization, moving from carbon-intensive to hydrogen-intensive fuels. And that's been going on for 150 years. It results in massive declines of air pollution, and it requires much less land. Nuclear is game-changing. It is the holy grail of energy. It's where we need to go. You can see this photo where I photoshopped in the whale in front of the nuclear plant. Totally joking. That is actually a whale in front of the nuclear plant. Seals and sea lions surrounding the nuclear plant, the most pristine tide pools in California outside that nuclear plant. Nuclear is not what we were taught it was. We're not going to switch to using electric cars and renewables, if only for one reason. It starts with the letter C. We're not going to reproduce this in the United States. We're not going to sacrifice our energy independence for dependence on a genocidal, totalitarian regime. You can thank fossil fuels for saving the hawksbill turtle. Excuse me. That's how the plastic that was stuck up its nose, we used to over-harvest those sea turtles, and we were able to save them by creating a plastic alternative from petrochemical waste. Much more to say, but suffice it to say, there's a better world available to us. You can find all of these slides at Environmental Progress, including why rising narcissism and nihilism is the greatest enemy and abundance is the alternative. Thank you very much. Appreciate you all. Thank you.